Hello, I'm Langston, and I'm back on my channel, Military Election Forecasting. Today I'm going to be talking about why Nikki Haley is such a bad candidate. So I wanted to kind of make a response video because, in particular to Let's Talk Elections, but more numerous, to numerous other election forecasters who, kind of have this obsession with Nikki Haley as a candidate, and, act like Nikki Haley is just such a, substantially strong candidate. And I want to talk about why Nikki Haley isn't really a strong candidate anywhere. And I think that, her ever making it on the electoral, her ever actually making it on the ticket would, really hurt Republicans a lot presidentially. Like, I don't realistically think she would outperform, Donald Trump or other Republicans really anywhere. She more than likely underperform. So another huge thing you keep hearing people say is polls. A lot of polls actually have Donald Trump outperforming Nikki Haley in a lot of polls. I do want to say that I don't realistically think polls matter that much, considering that what we saw in 2022, as well as this year as well. Like we've seen polls are not really that accurate. So in the, end of the day, like I don't. We're looking at map. We're looking at actual demographic groups. We talk about actually demographic groups in terms of race, ethnic groups, as well as social class. We know Nikki Haley doesn't really have that much appeal to any of those voters. So let's jump into it. So the first thing, you hear people talk about is independence. And I don't realistically think independence really even too much exists. I think that people know if they're going to vote Democrat or Republican or not. They might say that they're independent, but they know damn well if they're going to vote for a Democrat or Republican. You have to be real. Like I want to say that um, only like 50% of Black people identify as Democrats, when over 90% of them vote Democrat every election. So then the day, like they might say they're independent, but they're never going to vote for a Republican. And that argument goes the same for rural voters. Most rural voters just don't identify as Republican. They might vote Republican, but the majority of them are either independent or a slight majority are conservative. That doesn't mean that they're actually open to voting for other groups besides Republicans. So just because someone says they're independent does not mean they're actual independent. And we've seen that, which is why Democrats and Republicans have such a consistent floor nationwide despite the circumstances. So that's something I want to clear because you hear people saying, "Oh, she'll do better with independents." Independents don't really exist. You can't prove to me where independents realistically have too much of an impact because independents were going to either vote for Joe Biden, they're either going to vote for Donald Trump regardless. And the ones that said they were independents were voters that had been shifting Democrat or shifting Republican regardless, whether we're talking about working class voters in the Rust Belt or we're talking about former, educated conservatives that became more democratic as time has went on. So at the end of the day, these voters have been shifting in a specific favor regardless of the circumstances. It had nothing to do with them being independent or not. So let's talk about it from an actual electoral perspective. So in Maine, and as well as New Hampshire, I do think Nikki Haley would do better. I think that she would do worse in Maine second district. I think that she does not have a lot of appeal to rural working class voters, and that would really hurt her in states like Maine. So that is something I did wanted to kind of like focus on because I think that Maine is a state where she wouldn't shine too much. A lot of these voters, rural working class, have been shifting in the era of Trump, but other Republicans lack the ability to connect with them the same way Donald Trump does, and that goes for anybody. I do think candidates like Ron DeSantis would do better than Nikki Haley. At the end of the day, I still think Nikki Haley would do well enough to hold on to it, as well as Iowa and Ohio. I do think Nikki Haley would underperform Donald Trump. Uh, Pretty substantially in some of these rural working class parts of Wisconsin. Like she would not get out these massive numbers. I do think she will hold on to enough of them. I do think that she would stop the bleeding in Delaware. Like the thing is, I don't think Nikki Haley could realistically stop the suburbs from turning left. Like you go to 2022, you'll see that Jerry Moran was actually the incumbent, and Kansas, like he long time incumbent for decades, and he couldn't even stop Johnson County from going blue when Democrats didn't even invest into this race. So at the end of the day, like you cannot really stop that. Like in Oklahoma City, well, this was pretty similar to what we saw from pretty similar performance to what we saw from Joe Biden, but he couldn't outperform Joe Biden either. He couldn't outperform Donald Trump in Oklahoma County, and it just goes on and on of incumbents struggling to do better in the suburbs. Like the suburbs are going to trend left regardless, as we saw in these wild counties. I do want to say Ron Johnson is a much more right wing candidate than Nikki Haley, at least on the outside looking in. At the end of the day, I don't realistically think that the suburbs are going to trend left despite the circumstances. I think like regardless of what's on the ballot, the suburbs are going to continue to trend left. But I think with Nikki Haley, they might only trend maybe a point or two to the left. I don't think it would be a dramatic shift like we've been seeing against Donald Trump. but I do think she would stop, tremendous bleeding in places like Delaware County and et cetera. I do think that, they would still trend left and she would, lose a lot more in the working class areas. And I also think that obviously she would not do well in the inner city black parts of Ohio, like Cleveland, like inner city Cincinnati and et cetera. So that, gets us to the main map, I say in Florida. I think that she would not connect as well with a lot of these Hispanic voters in Southern Florida. Like, I don't think that a lot of these voters would be too connecting towards her as they were towards Donald Trump. And I also think that, she would not do as well in some of the more rural working class parts of Florida and some of the panhandle counties, et cetera. At the end of the day, I think she will hold on to enough to be able to easily win Florida, though. So that's that. In Texas, I think Nikki Haley um, you know, I'm not gonna sit up and say she's a better candidate than Donald Trump. I don't think she's really a weaker. Like I think she'll do a lot worse in these rural areas. Like she would really struggle turning out rural voters, in my opinion. They wouldn't really coalesce around her. I do think she'd do better in Denton, Collin, Williamson County. At the end of the day, I don't think she'd do tremendously better, considering that I want to say that Williamson, Biden won by roughly a point. We go to 2022, and we saw that Greg Abbott couldn't even win this county by more than a point. Like we look at Denton, he won Collin by 10, he won Denton by 11. Like that's like just showing you the fact that Trump won this by 4, he won this by 7. Like damn, like he only outran Trump by a couple points in Denton and Collin, and he only outran him by a point in Williamson with a dramatically more Republican environment, despite being the incumbent, a more fiscally conservative governor. It really shows you that these areas are really gone for Republicans. And I do want to make the argument that yes, 2022 was a year where abortion was on the ballot. But you get my point. Like these suburbs are going to continue trending left regardless. I think that, Nikki Haley, she might nearly hold on to Colin or nearly lose Colin. I do think she would still hold on in Denton. I think Trump might lose Denton. I think she would be able to probably win Denton by a percent or two, maybe 3 or 4 points. But, she will hold on in Denton. She might lose Colin. She would do worse in Torrance. Obviously, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, she would do really bad in the inner cities. But again, I think there's places she would outperform Donald Trump and in Texas, but by and large, she would not perform too well. Just looking at the math, looking at the data, she just does not really have that many places to improve. What causes Nikki Haley the election is just off the bat, I think that she loses the Rust Belt, like as well as Nevada. I think that she would really struggle to turn out these rural voters in, Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. This is something that George W. Bush, Mitt Romney, they all wanted to be able to do what Trump was able to achieve. And she would fail to get out these voters. These voters would not be open to voting for her, as you saw with other Republicans. So she would, just with that alone, she couldn't really stay competitive in these states because she would do so much worse in these rural areas with turnout. I don't think she would do worse with the ones that showed up. And in terms of turnout would be a lot down in these areas, and that alone would cause her to lose. On top of the fact that I don't realistically think that she would even do better in these areas than Donald Trump. Like I don't think that she would. And I talked about this in a previous election, but this is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And we saw that Carmen Coluccio, she was more so of a moderate Republican. She was from Montgomery County, and she still underperformed Donald Trump in the suburbs. Like she lost Chester County by 32 points. Let's go to 2000. Um, 2020, Donald Trump only lost Montgomery by 26. She did 6 points worse than Trump there. Let's look at Delaware County. She lost Delaware by 24. I think that she got like the same numbers as Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost Delaware actually by 26. So she actually did a little bit better. I apologize. She actually did better there. So I was wrong. She did a little bit better there, but not tremendously. Let's look at Chester. She lost Chester by 18%. We go to 2000. These things keep reloading. So hard to keep up with. But she didn't do better than Trump in these suburbs, despite being a more moderate Republican, despite being more electorally sound. It didn't really make a big impact in these states. She still struggled where it mattered. So realistically, you're not going to see too much of a difference when talking about those specific issues because despite having a candidate that could do that, they still did worse in those areas. And you can bring up the topic of abortion, but at the end of the day, these areas are going to continue trending left regardless. Same thing in Oakland and Same thing with Oakland and Kent County as well, in Michigan, as well as the wild counties in Wisconsin. I do think Nikki Haley would do better in the wild counties compared to other conservatives, but I don't think that she would stop them from trending left. They're trending left regardless, despite the circumstances. So she wouldn't be able to do too much better there. And she would do a lot worse in these working class and rural parts of the state. And with her recent comments, she'd be able to motivate a good amount of black voters to turn out in some of these inner cities like Detroit, like Philadelphia, like Milwaukee, and that would really hurt her, across the state because Republicans rely on bad turnout from black voters in these inner cities to have a realistic chance of winning. And I want to move on to some of these southern states because, a lot of people say, oh, well, Nikki Haley, she might not be a strong candidate for the Rust Belt, but she's a strong candidate for the Sun Belt, which I really disagree with. We talk about Georgia, for example. When we're talking about Brian Kemp had an R+6 electorate. He had a electorate Trump would have won by 6, and he won by 7. So at the end of the day, we don't really see him overperform Donald Trump really anywhere. He really had an electorate that benefited him, an electorate where black turnout was down, and the share of Georgia's white population was up. And when looking at it, Nikki Haley is a really bad candidate for turning out rural voters in Georgia. Like she really struggled to get Trump numbers in these rural areas. Like I don't think she'd be able to connect with a lot of these voters in rural Georgia. Like I think she really struggled to turn out, rural voters in the Atlanta metro area, like in the, outside of Atlanta and et cetera. And that would really hurt her. Like it would really be able to stop her from netting a lot of votes because Republicans really depend on turning out white rural voters to realistically have too much an impact. And I'm not gonna sit up and say that you see black voters come out guns blazing against her like you saw in 2020. But her comments about slavery and et cetera, black people will never forget. They will never forget. Like people keep saying, "Oh, people forget it," but they won't. They don't forget about the comments Donald Trump made about the Central Park Five in the '90s. They don't forget about the things he said about African countries being shitholes. They don't forget about the comments that he said about the Black Lives Matter movement, about George Floyd and etc. They didn't forget about what Hillary Clinton said, in the '90s when she called she when she was talking about black communities being super predators and etc. Black people in these inner cities in the Rust Belt, they remembered that and they didn't turn out to vote. They primarily cost Hillary Clinton the presidency because of the comments she made 20 years ago. We're talking about Joe Biden. They didn't forget about Joe Biden's crime, but they didn't forget about Joe Biden saying you're not black if you don't vote for me. At the end of the day, they're never gonna forget the shit Nikki Haley said. They're never gonna forget. So that's gonna have a that's gonna be a huge problem for her in the Rust Belt in Georgia, North Carolina. And I don't think that she is to the extent of what Ron DeSantis has done. Like they don't see her as any kind of threat the same way they see Ron DeSantis. Many of them don't really even know who Nikki Haley is. But as soon as those comments were to hit in a general election, that shit would really hurt her in some of these other southern states. Realistically, I'm not considering say she would lose them just because I think that Biden would still struggle to turn out black voters. And even though she was struggling to turn out white rural voters, I think it'd be like a net loss. Then the day she want to do better in these Atlanta suburban counties. These Atlanta suburban counties are becoming rapidly more black. These are voters that would never vote for a Republican candidate. So because of that, unless Nikki Haley can do better with black voters in the Atlanta metro area, she can't stop these suburbs from trending to the left because they are the majority demographic in these metro areas. And the very same thing in North Carolina. But what's worse in North Carolina for Republicans is that Democrats have a much more sizable floor with college educated white voters, with more white voters that are more eligible to voting for Democrats, where despite them not being able to win because of black turnout, they're not completely like overly reliant on black voters. They still can't win without them, but they do have a more solid floor. While in Georgia, they don't have that for Democrats. In Arizona, I think Nikki Haley has somewhat of a chance. I think she comes off as more, more moderate, more John McCain-esque. At the end of the day, Arizona has been trending so far to the left, and when we've seen, more moderate Republicans still struggling in Arizona, there is no bet that she'd still be able to win Arizona despite those circumstances. So at the end of the day, I think she had to have a chance in Arizona, like, a pretty sizable chance. But realistically, I still think that, some of these voters, like I said, they're shifting left in the suburbs regardless. So Trump can, you can run a non-Trump Republican, but they're not going to stop these college educated voters from trending left. They were trending left before Trump. They were trending left. When you look at how Mitt Romney performed with them relative to George W. Bush, these areas were trending left far before Donald Trump. And Nikki Haley is not going to be the person to stop that. The same way no Democrat can stop these working class areas from trending to Republicans, at least on in a federal election. So because of that, like Nikki Haley does not have a place she's going to do better in really anywhere, and people ramping her up like, she would realistically do better than Trump in any of these states. Like, if she is has a huge hope of potentially being elected, it's just delusional. And a lot of people look for some answer to solve Republicans' demographic issues. At the end of the day, Nikki Haley is not the candidate for that. And I want to clear another argument you hear people saying about Nikki Haley is, oh, well, Nikki Haley, she's a person of color, as if Black people care about an Indian conservative, and as if Hispanic voters are going to vote for an Indian person because she's another minority. Black people didn't even want to vote for Herschel Walker. They didn't even want to vote for John James or for Daniel Cameron, who were Black Republicans. So why would they vote for a conservative from another racial demographic? Same thing with Hispanic conservatives. You have seen Hispanic conservatives do better, especially in the era of Maya Flores, as well as I want to talk about uh, Marco Rubio, but by and large, you don't see them make too much gains with Hispanic voters. So with that, she's not going to motivate those voters to come into her column, especially Black voters who she would need in the Rust Belt in Georgia, North Carolina, and especially with her comments about slavery. So at the end of the day, you can't really make that argument anywhere. When looking at the map, when looking at actual demographic groups, you can't point to a demographic group that Nikki Haley is going to do too well with. So because of that, that's really all I have to say about the 2000, about Nikki Haley and her future aspects in terms of potentially getting reelected. She does not really have that much of a chance of ever winning a head-to-head matchup with any Democratic candidate, despite, a lot of her, ramp up on the internet, despite people seeing her as a potentially more stable force. So end of the day, that's all I wanted to talk about on my channel. Please like, comment, and subscribe down below. Make sure you have a nice day, you guys. Goodbye.